Good day. I am Mary Ann H. Asayson from BS Ed English 1A. So for this discussion we will be talking about the different perspective of language, dialect, and variety in these different sources. Those sources are Katchru and Nelson's perspective, the Professor Handke and Professor Kumar's perspective. Now, the focus of Katchru and Nelson's source is on re-examining the concepts that have been the mainstay of the ELT profession regardless of the context of teaching, learning, and using language, and the status of those concepts in the new context of growing research on world Englishes. Here, we have the reality of native and non-native. So the designation that served the ELT profession were native versus non-native speakers. So they were designated as native and non-native speakers since it is a big issue learning English in other foreign language. So, for example, if you go and teach English, let's say Australia, you teach English in Australia. So the English language that you are to teach in the Department of English is separated from the English language they speak. Although the Australian English language and English language are partly the same, however, it differs from the pronunciation on how the phonology work since it is under the influence of English variation of language. On the other hand, if you teach English in Australia, you are designated as a non-native speaker. Next, the worth and advisability of teaching students another language as opposed to refining their own has been intuitively regarded as an acceptable matter of argument. So, learning another language is to be regarded because it is useful to know the culture and traditions that a language, especially in a certain situation. It is crucial to learn the variations of language for the acceptability of our knowledge and avoid being arrogant and make judgments. Like for example, whenever you watch a silent drama or a silent movie, you often laugh at the way they speak because of how phonology works at their language. And then situation happens like you're given an opportunity to silent. So in order for you to adapt living there, you need to study their ways of living, most especially their language. And you realize why they speak like that, why they speak like this, is that because of the culture of their language. So the worth and advisability of teaching students another language is to be regarded for the reason that it will benefit them to be able to communicate with people with other languages, and that won't lead to misunderstanding or misconceptions. Let's go now to Professor Handke's perspective. So before Professor Handke give his own definition or his perspective about language, dialect, and variety, he then give us 3 problems for us to have an idea of how he defined language, dialect, and variety. Let us start by first defining the problems presented by the Professor Handke in his video discussion. So we have here 3 problems. So the problems are Dutch versus German, Chinese, and the Jamaican Creole. So the first problem illustrates that Dutch speakers clearly understand what German or the German language. However, German speakers can't understand Dutch language. So this problem illustrates direction problem of intelligibility. Okay, so another example that would connect to this problem is this one, Tagalog versus Cebuano. So Cebuano speakers can understand Tagalog. However, Tagalog speakers can't understand Cebuano language. So the influence of language matters on the intelligibility of language you have as a speaker of that certain place, like Cebuanos and Tagalogs. Next, we go on Chinese as our next problem. So it demonstrates the differences of a variety considering the work of phonology. So on the example of Professor Handke, he let a Mandarin speaker hears the varieties of Chinese language. So as per observation, the Mandarin speaker can't understand some of other varieties of the Chinese language, even though it only has the same meaning. It is the phonology that is working why the Mandarin speaker can't understand other varieties of her language. So that's why it is very important, or it is crucial, to familiarize the correct or the varieties of a certain language, because we can be tricked by the levels of linguistic. So what are the levels of linguistic? So those are the phonetics, to phonology, to morphology, to syntax, to semantics, down to pragmatics. So another example that can associate with this problem is the varieties of English. It is also part of varieties of English. So these are the British English versus United States versus Australian English. So I know that you've been familiar, since this is also part of the very first discussion in this subject. So from these varieties of English, it can have a problem in distinguishing understanding. So these three countries do speak English language. However, the work of phonology makes it a variety of English. That's why when these three countries talk to each other, it can sometimes lead to misunderstanding, since the pronunciation differs because of their varieties, or because differs of their variations of English language. Now, Jamaican Creole. So the Jamaican Creole has the problem of the concept of the neutral intelligibility. Although there are some English words presented in the given story by through the discussion of Professor Handke in a Jamaican Creole, yet we can't understand the whole thought of the story. So that was the presented problems on the perspective of Professor Handke. So, on the perspective of Professor Handke, language cannot be defined by just a simple definition. However, it needs the following criteria. So, according to Professor Handke, you cannot define language by just a simple definition. However, it needs the 5 criteria. So, what are these 5 criteria? So, these are the standardization, the vitality, the autonomy, reduction, and the norms. So, first in line is standardization. So, language is evolved or evolving in a certain degree of standardization. That is the development of the grammar. Language can be defined through standard form, and that is through grammar, spelling rules, etc. Next is vitality. These refer to the existence of the living community of speakers. Next, number 3 is autonomy. It is a matter of feeling. According to him, a language must be felt different from different languages. So, but as we've already seen for the example with Jamaican Creole, this is a matter of degree rather than all or none criterion. Next, number 4 is reduction. So, reduced written standard, reduced functions in society help to distinguish varieties from standard languages. Next, we have the norms. It is between good and bad, where languages normally involve norms, varieties don't. So the speaker of language have a feeling that they are good or bad speakers. How? And that good speakers, they represent as norms of proper usage. For example, in prescriptive English, let's say, do not split infinitives. That is how they represent as a good speaker. So, language variety or sub-variety, which many linguists called it a dialect, are 3 main types of variety or dialect. These are the regional variety or dialect. It is the regional difference between the speaker of a language. So, for example, the Australian English dialect. There are 3 major subgroups of the Australian English dialect. So those are the Standard Australian English, the Aboriginal English, and the Ethnocultural Australian English. Next is social dialect. It is when 2 or more people speak with one another. The language is always influenced by the number of social factors. By the word itself, social, it is influenced by social factors. Like for example, group of friends talking to each other. There are certain words that other people can't understand and that only exclusive to the circle of friends. I know you're very you are very familiar with these situations. So these unfamiliar words are the kind of words which has been influenced by social factors considering the generation they're in. Lastly, the phonological dialect. It is much likely associated with the accent. The classification of phonology, how they pronounce words. So on the picture shown, we have British English and American English. So these Englishes varies on how they pronounce words, how does the phonology works, which made them a variety or a dialect of English language. Moving on, we are now down to Professor Kumar perspective. So according to him, language is an innate human capacity. It is developing on us. So from the time we are born to learning our L1 up to learning our L2. So that is his definition of language. Next is, it is a fully structured system. So it has a structure, or it has structured all levels like sounds, the words, the sentences, and the discourse. Next is, language defines humans. So the whole system when become external of individual, and in such a case, it defines humans. Next is, it is used in society, and the rules of language use are very systematic, as well in the same sense as we say language is structured. So it is both individual as well as social identity. So the moment become out of individual, that is, it becomes articulated. When we, in the simplest term, the moment when we speak, it becomes a social entity. So now, we'll go on the relationship between language and society. First in line is the grammaticality versus acceptability. Sentence have to be grammatical, and when we say grammatical or sentence is grammatical, we primarily refer to the rules of language. However, the acceptability depends on the rules of language use. That is why we can say a sentence is possible out of its context, but it will remain unacceptable. So, next is society. And the term society can be identified or can be defined as a group. Also, you can have a definition of your society, like a group drawn together for a purpose is called society. So when we use the language in the society, we need at least 2 people in the group, and even though there is nothing visibly common between the two which form the group, here is what will be the common. So the 2 people who are interacting with one another, they are interacting for the purpose of interaction. So that is society. Next is identity. So the linguistic construction of the members in one or more social group or categories, that is identity. Next is the term identity is not like male or female, lesbian or LGBTQ. It's not what we call the identity. It is another aspect. So it is a nuisance way of referencing. So identities are constructed. Identities depend on several parts. And why we want to understand, or what we want to understand in this term, is because language happens to be one of the strongest markers for construction of identity. So another term which is going to be used several times is this speech community. This is an interesting context of understanding of society. So individuals who linguistically behave alike, or like speak the same language, or a dialect or variety, we are using the 3 terms at this time without making any distinction between them. That is speech community. Now, we will go now to dialect. So, in Professor Kumar's perspective, there is no distinction between language and a dialect. So, there are this, according to Professor Kumar, they are the same thing, or they are just the same. According to the quote he mentioned in his perspective, a language is a dialect with an army and navy. Meaning to say, language is a dialect with different varieties. The army and navy there is the representation of varieties. That language have many varieties, which explains that a language is a dialect. So we underline that individuals only speak varieties because language includes several varieties within. So the term dialect or language go all the way to making distinction between languages of individuals, which is also called idiolect. But that will help us understand the term language and dialect, that we speak different varieties, then what we speak is actually dialect. Therefore, the definition of dialect can only be a language is a dialect. No more other definition, but a language is a dialect, according to Professor Kumar's perspective. So I think that's all. That is all my understanding about the different perspective from Katchru and Nelson perspective, Professor Handke perspective and Professor Kumar's perspective. Thank you for listening.